You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on February 19th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. So, for the past number of weeks, we've been looking at various thresholds we can cross in order to move toward the second naïveté, which is about finding a new innocence or sense of joy, wonder, and awe once we've traversed the wilderness of suffering, or perhaps brought a critical lens to our life or our inherited tradition. So we've talked about 3 thresholds so far. The first one was dealing contemplatively with our thoughts. Then we discussed dealing contemplatively with our emotions. And then last week, we talked about dealing contemplatively with our fears about mortality. And tonight, I want to explore with you the path of self-acceptance. True self-acceptance emerges when we no longer confuse or conflate our true self with our thoughts, feelings, emotions, which are all aspects of our embodiment. And so at the outset tonight, I want to place these thresholds in the constellation of Richard Rohr's stages of spiritual development, because my hope is that they'll help us clarify what we're talking about here. So to briefly summarize, he has 9 stages, and you can look them up if you're interested. I'm not going to get into them tonight, but what I want to do is summarize them so we can get the bigger picture here. So firstly, if you review them, you'll notice that every stage contains the phrase, I am, in it. So for instance, stage 1 is, my body and self-image is who I am. So what you'll notice initially is that for Rohr, spiritual development is about identity. It is about knowing who we are. It's about the adventure of coming to touch the truth of who we are. And when we think of knowing, we shouldn't think of it as head knowledge, okay? It's one thing to read about the stages of growth and to comprehend or understand them with our minds, but it's another thing entirely to know them with the fullness of our embodiment, with the fullness of our person. It's another thing altogether to go through each of these stages and let them consolidate in our hearts, minds, and souls or bodies. That is in part why we've titled this series of conversations Coming Home, because the spiritual journey is always about the dance between homesickness and homecoming to the true self. Okay, so with that said, the first 4 stages of Rohr's theory is about conflating our identity with aspects of our embodiment. So thoughts, emotions, deeper intuitions, etc. I am my thoughts. I am my feelings. I am the felt knowledge in my body. And to be clear, when he's inviting us to move through these stages and perhaps to transcend them, he's not denying that we all have thoughts and feelings and bodily intuitions. He's simply allowing them to take their place in the bigger picture of our self. They are not the true self. They are simply what they are, aspects of our embodiment, and should be seen as such. Then, he says, often if we can move through these stages, we end up brushing up against a dark night and have to wrestle with the question, if I'm not all of those things that are very real to me, those aspects of my embodiment, who or what am I? And this is where we begin our shadow work of having to grapple with our sheer inability to perform any kind of perfection, and let go of all of our attempts at creating a real self by superior moral behavior or by finding the proper spiritual technique. Here, he says, the false self is beginning to die in a major way. And this is fascinating to me, having spent a lot of time in religious and spiritual circles, because what I see here is that, for instance, Christians who no longer emphasize something like right belief switch almost overnight to emphasize something like right behavior, thinking that that is the solution to their frustrations with their own spiritual tradition. But Rohr is saying, no, that's actually not the end of it. Obviously, moving from denying something like climate change is real to moving toward acting on behalf of planetary sustainability is a good thing. I'm not saying those aren't healthy and positive shifts. Remember, the spiritual adventure is all about identity. And the issue that Rohr takes with this is that we can easily think that if we just become the good kinds of Christians, if we just get on the right side of history, then we will find our true selves. But again, while moving toward doing more good in the world is a wonderful and positive thing, it can become a new sense of false self, that what makes us truly good is performing the right actions all the time, which, spoiler alert, none of us can actually do. And the good news is our belovedness is so much deeper than what we perform. Our belovedness is the container within which all of our thoughts, emotions, bodily intuitions, moral actions, etc., arise and fall. And this is vital to understand because the last 3 stages of Rohr's spiritual growth paradigm are about comprehending that there is a sustaining love at the center of our being. And that is the ground that we can rest upon. So these last few stages begin with the feeling that there's actually an absence or a void within us. And again, this is something we know not by understanding it, but by falling into it and perhaps learning to trust that it is true of us. So I actually think that in these final stages, what that absence is, or what actually disappears, is something real. It's the ego. When we can move through all of our thoughts, emotions, feelings, and fears, we are doing battle with all the ways our ego tries to control the data of our experience, and especially dictate the data of who we are. So losing that egoic isness about ourselves is so difficult because those are real things that we have to grieve, move through, and let go of in order to set the taproot of our hearts in an invincible love, as Jim Finley says it. That is not grounded in thoughts, feelings, fears, or moral performance, but is plugged into a different energy source. And here the very mystery and beauty of ourselves begins to take full form. And what ends up happening is that we see God within us. And with the false egoic self no longer guiding the ship, we come to the precipice of spiritual realization. And Rohr says it this way. He says, the highest stage of spiritual realization is, I am who I am. I'm just me, warts and all. We are now fully detached from our own self-image and living in God's image of us, which includes and loves both the good and the bad, which loves and welcomes all our thoughts, all our feelings, all our intuitions without judgment. And in that place, we can experience true serenity and freedom. So Rohr notes that this is a peace the world cannot give, like it talks about in John 14:27. And it's where we're fully resting in God, the divinity within each of us. And this is what the Eastern Christian tradition calls theosis, or becoming like God, or becoming united with God. This is where God disappears as an object that we can hold up and look at, and through the stepping aside of the ego, God reappears as the subjectivity and preciousness of each of our very lives moving through time. So God goes from something out there to the very center of our being. Now, I want to focus tonight on self-acceptance because you'll notice that the first stage and the last stage sound very similar, right? Like the first stage is my body and self-image are who I am. And the last, stage, the ninth stage is I am who I am, embodiment and all. But here's the fundamental difference. They're kind of like inversions of each other. At the beginning, we think that we are our interests. We are what we do. We are what we say. We are what we think or feel. And the truth is, as I mentioned, all of those things really are a part of our actual lives. But at the end of this process, we learn to say that we love and embrace our interests. We love and embrace what we do. We love and embrace what we say, even if we say the wrong thing. We love and embrace what we think or feel, all in non-judgmental welcome. because we don't believe that any of those things have the final say about who we are. Does that make sense? Like, those are the aspects of ourself that are fleeting and changing, and those are the things that will pass away when, as we talked about last week, we all pass away. So what will be preserved is instead the everlasting beauty of your life as an instantiation and intimation of the one cosmic divine life. So seeing this inversion, that we really can embrace all those mundane embodied parts of ourselves, is so important because it invites us to give ourselves back to our everyday lives with the same welcome and embrace, knowing that the invincible love that grounds all of reality grounds you and me as well. Here, every part of ourself can be welcomed, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the past, present, and future failures, the fear and doubt and concern, the pain and suffering and struggle, the joy and beauty and ecstasy. Everything belongs, precisely because it is a part of your actual, real, and thoroughly human life. I can't stress this enough. If we can learn to become hospitable to the whole of ourselves, no longer trying to exclude our more disappointing or confusing parts, if we can become like a resonance chamber for the complexity of being alive where every part belongs, we might come to discover that there is nothing missing anywhere. We've talked about this thing called internal family systems before, as we read Richard Schwartz's book, No Bad Parts, as a community. And I love that book because it teaches us a very similar pedagogy of attending to the inner life. It helps us to see that there is no part of us that doesn't belong. Even those managers and firefighters and exiles that flare up and seem to overwhelm our underlying capital S self, which is Schwartz's word for the true self. It really is true that each of these parts need to have a place, to be heard, and to be welcomed in order to restore mental balance and harmony. And this is a form of self-acceptance. So perhaps one way to encourage us tonight is to say that those parts of each of us that we have the most difficult time including, maybe it's a past failure, maybe it's some persisting judgmentalism, maybe we have personality tics or traits that we really wish would go away but aren't going anywhere. Those are the parts that need the most loving attention and inclusion so we can move into just accepting, I am who I am, warts and all. Again, I'll reiterate that this is not a mental exercise in writing down all those aspects of ourselves and listing them out and saying, you all belong. You know, the process of spiritual growth is about attending to this growing self-acceptance. And when we're able to move more deeply into this place where every part of our story belongs within us, we end up crossing a threshold into the second naivete. And if you'll remember with me, when we're grounded in this place, internal family systems teaches us that the resulting qualities are playfulness, patience, presence, perspective, and persistence. And this is a beautiful way to think of what it feels like to live into the second naivete. And if you'll notice with me, finding a playfulness with this deepened level of patience and presence and perspective is what it's like to come into touch with the inner child as an adult, which is what we're going to be exploring next week. And so I'm so looking forward to this conversation tonight and to closing things out next week. Let's chat. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @WayCollective. Peace and every good, y'all.